Hi, I'm Larry Waldrop, Administrator for SonarWorld, and my guest this morning is Claude Cohen-Bacri, who's Executive Vice President for Supersonic Imagine. We recently carried a news story on SonarWorld about FDA clearance of the first real-time numeric scale for elastography, and we've asked Claude to come and talk a little bit about what that is and how it's going to change elastography. Claude?
Yes, as you know, ShearWave elastography is an imaging method which displays a map of the stiffness of tissue in color. And in any imaging method, every pixel that is displayed on an image is the result of a calculation. In ShearWave elastography, every pixel in an image is the result of the calculation of the speed of the shear wave that propagates in tissue, and this speed of shear wave is indicative of the stiffness of tissue. Being able to adjust the dynamic scale on an image will enable the user to adjust the visualization and to get an optimal visualization of contrast on these ShearWave elastography images. If you have a display which is, let's say, between 0 and 7 meters per second on a ShearWave elastography image, 0 being blue and 7 being red, then if the user wants to optimally see lower contrast, it can move the scale down from 0 to 3, let's say, to see a better contrast on an image. And of course, this scale will be different per organ, per lesion in a given organ. If you look at the breast, for instance, and you want to look at lymph nodes instead of lesions, you may want to use a lower dynamic range.
So that's very similar to a dynamic range adjustment in other areas in ordinary imaging.
That is exactly the same adjustable dynamic range like in every other imaging modality. In B mode, you may want to adjust your dynamic range. In color Doppler, you may want to adjust your dynamic range depending on the speed of blood flow that you measure. Now in ShearWave, you get again that same capability of being able to adjust the dynamic range to see the exact optimal stiffness variation that you want to depict on tissue.
That's a very interesting development. How will that impact clinical application of elastography?
I think it will impact the clinical application in two ways. In fact, depending on the clinical framework you're in. The diagnosis clinical framework, where you're looking at the lesion and you want to characterize that lesion using ShearWave elastography. When you do that, obviously, the ShearWave elastography numerical scale should not be the same depending on the organ you're looking at. So you will want to make sure that you are in an optimal dynamic range when you look at the breast or the prostate or tendons. And you want to make sure that you have optimal contrast for that diagnosis framework. Now, there's a second very interesting clinical framework, and that is follow-up of lesions or follow-up of organs. And before I develop that point, I may stress the fact that follow-up is possible with ShearWave elastography because it is a reproducible exam. And it is a reproducible exam because like in any other elastography method, ShearWave elastography depends on the generation of a mechanical constraint in tissue. But what's interesting in ShearWave elastography is that the constraint, the mechanical constraint, the small vibration which is generated in tissue is generated using ultrasound pulses using acoustic radiation force. So you do not rely on any motion of the transducer, any pressure of the transducer, which is what you do when you do static elastography. What you just want to do is to gently apply the transducer, and the ultrasound will generate the constraint in a reproducible way every time. And because you have a reproducible exam, you can now think of following up that organ in time, and you know that if you are in the same dynamic range, and if you see differences in the image of this organ, then you know that it is because the organ has changed. So obviously the follow-up is useful for monitoring therapies, but also for monitoring simply the evolution of a disease of an organ. So if I take a simple example, let's say I'm looking at a breast lesion. Usually, when I have a lesion in the breast, I will want to follow up the evolution of its size when I look at B mode. Now, with ShearWave elastography, you will also be able to look at the evolution of the stiffness of that lesion in time. If I use the same exact dynamic range, which is now possible because you have these numbers displayed next to the color scale, at time 0 and T0 plus 6 months, let's say. And if I see changes in the pattern of ShearWave, then I know that it is because the organ has changed, lesion has changed.
Interesting. So you can reproduce the study at a much higher level than you can now because of this new numeric scale.
Exactly. It allows you to have confidence in the fact that if you see changes in structures of tissue, and if you make sure that the stiffness, that the ShearWave numerical scale is set at the exact same level, then you can rely on the changes you see to say that the changes come from the tissue.
So that's going to be an interesting new capability. Once I acquire an image with the numeric scale on it, is that now fixed, or can I adjust it in some way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's actually a dual capability with that adjustable numerical scale. You can adjust the numerical scale while you scan, and you will obviously see the changes on the display of the image. But even when an image has been acquired, you have all these data in the machine, all the measurement of the speed of the ShearWave everywhere on an image for a given dynamic range that are in the machine. So even if you have a frozen image, you can now go back and readjust the dynamic range after the fact, where the patient is not there anymore, just to adjust the contrast after the fact on that acquisition that you made previously.
So even on a stored image that's still in the machine, I could go back and adjust or optimize that scale?
Exactly, because all the data are in the machine.
Okay, this sounds like an important advance in elastography that a clinician can use immediately. Is the technology available now in the United States?
The technology is available in the United States, and we just received clearance for that numerical adjustable scale.
All right. Thank you very much, Claude. We appreciate the explanation and look forward to seeing this exciting new product in the marketplace.
Thank you.